Welcome to Talks History with Donnie Dotson. I've always had a soft spot for alternate history. Not the kind with dragons or steam-powered zeppelins, although those are kind of fun too, but the kind that makes you sit back and think, what if that one decision had gone differently? What if a battle had turned the other way? What if a different religion caught fire? What if a single person hadn't died or had? Because history isn't this clean, inevitable march forward. It's fragile, messy, full of moments that could have tipped another direction with just a little nudge. And that idea fascinates me. Not because I want to rewrite the past, but because it helps you see just how strange and contingent the present really is. The world we live in feels normal, even obvious, but it could have looked completely different, and sometimes it almost did. Some of the best alternate history scenarios are the ones hiding in plain sight. You don't have to reach that far. You just have to look for the paths that we didn't take, the movements that almost won, the gods we almost worshipped. Which brings me to today's story. I want to start with a mental exercise. Picture the world as we know it, our world here in the West. Glass office buildings scraping the sky, morning commutes on packed subways and highways, cafes on every corner, the dull glow of smartphones lighting up tired faces. It's modern and familiar, a world held together by invisible threads of a shared culture. Rituals, holidays, phrases, and values we rarely even stop to question. The West, for all its complexity and different belief systems, still walks to the beat of one ancient drum that shapes everything from its culture to its language to its customs. The story of Christianity. But what if we change one beat to that drum? Just one, and everything slightly shifts. Imagine a world where Christianity never won. A world where the crucifixion isn't the symbol etched into our churches or worn around necks. Instead, in this parallel history, the dominant force behind Western civilization is the cult of Mithras. In this world, December isn't about a virgin birth in Bethlehem. It's a celebration of the winter solstice, marked by subterranean feast and candlelit temples. There's no Christmas tree. No manger, no carols. Instead, men gather in silence to honor Mithras, the warrior god who slew the cosmic bull to set the world in motion. And his sacrifice, not Christ, becomes the central myth retold across generations. There's no golden rule of love thy neighbor, no virtues about the meek inheriting the earth. This isn't a religion of humility. It's one of trials, strength, hierarchy, spiritual ascent through the 7 stages of initiation, one each harder than the last. Courage, loyalty, endurance. These are the virtues celebrated, not forgiveness, grace, or self-denial. Think about it for a second. What does a world shaped by that theology look like? Instead of churches towering over town squares, we have Mithrae, underground chambers built like caves, their ceilings painted with stars, the air thick with incense. The center of worship would be a relief of Mithras, dagger in hand, driving it into the bull's neck. From its blood came all life, they believed, just as the Christian tradition says we all live through the blood of Christ. But here, divinity is violent, it's purposeful and earned. Children might grow up hearing tales of Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, and recite mantras about order, cosmic justice, and secrecy. Sundays wouldn't be days of rest and recuperation. They'd be reserved for sacred rites, acts of purification, and moral test. Confession isn't about unburdening your soul. It's about proving your worth to ascend to the next grade. Even our language would shift. Think about how deeply Christianity has shaped the words that we use. Salvation, sin, blessing, grace. All of it would be different. In the Mithraic world, perhaps we'd say someone is initiated instead of saved. Maybe instead of sinners, we talked about the untested and the unworthy. And society? It would still be structured, still filled with power struggles and politics, but maybe more militarized, more coded with ritual. Women were largely excluded from Mithraism in Rome. It was a soldier's faith, a brotherhood bound by secrecy. So what does that do to gender roles over centuries? To institutions of equality that seem just normal today? To ideas about who gets to speak to the divine? Now let's pull back, because this isn't just pure fiction. For a time in history, this could have happened. In the 2nd and 3rd century CE, Mithraism was rising fast in the Roman world. Worshipped by legionaries, favored by emperors, and practiced from Britannia to the banks of the Euphrates. It was a real contender for the soul of the West, and for a while, it looked like it might win. This is the story of Christ's first rival, the cult of Mithras. Not a myth, not a sideshow, but a serious force in the ancient world that almost rewrote all of our history. Long before Roman legionaries worshipped his name in smoky, stone-hewn temples beneath the streets of Londinium and Ostia, long before his likeness was etched into bas relief, cloaked unfurling like wings, dagger poised over the haunch of a bull, Mithras was already ancient. He was a god of another world entirely. And his name was Mithra then, and he belonged to the Persians. In the Avesta, the sacred hymns of Zoroastrianism, Mithra rides across the sky in a golden chariot, drawn by white horses that breathe fire. He is radiant, all-seeing, and ever-watchful, a divine judge who cannot be deceived. His eyes were said to shine like the sun, casting light into every corner of the earth, exposing lies, punishing the wicked and untruthful, and upholding the sacred contract, or Mithra, that bound men together in trust and brotherhood. He wasn't just a sun god, he was the force of cosmic truth. And his presence was felt in every oath, every treaty, every handshake between kings. To swear falsely in Mithra's name was to invite ruin to your people. And he was everywhere. In the courts of the Achaemenids, his name was carved into stone beside Ahura Mazda, the great creator. In Persepolis, his image stood sentinel over the halls of empire. The kings invoked him before battle. The priest honored him with sacred fires. He was a god of light, yes, but also of justice, order, and war when necessary. But as centuries passed, empires rose and fell, and gods traveled, changing names, shedding skins, adopting new symbols to survive. And by the time Mithra reached the western edge of the Roman world, he'd become Mithras, and his story had changed. This new Mithras was not born from heaven, but from stone, in the heart of a cave, a place between worlds. He emerged fully grown, a torch in one hand and a dagger in the other. He stood alone in the dark, a god of initiation and struggle. And from that moment, the story unfolds like a cosmic parable, one layered in mystery and symbolism, passed not through scripture, but through images carved into stone reliefs, deep beneath Roman streets. The central myth of Mithras was one of sacrifice. At the dawn of time, the sun sent Mithras a divine task, to slay the primordial bull, the cosmic beast that held within it the seed of all life. Mithras, after much hesitation, wrestled the beast into submission and plunged his dagger into its side. From the slain bull's blood and marrow sprang all living things, plants, animals, and the cycle of time itself. The bull's tail became wheat, its blood wine, its breath the winds of the earth. And from this divine act of violence came life, fertility, and order to all living things. It is in this scene, the Tauroctony, that is found in every Mithraeum, the secret temples where initiates gathered. Always Mithras is shown in the same pose, kneeling on the bull, dagger in hand, looking away as he makes the fatal cut. A dog, a snake, and a scorpion attend the scene, feeding from the blood or clutching the bull's genitals, symbols of death and rebirth intertwined. But this was not a religion of public temples or open-air ceremonies. Mithraism was a mystery religion, built around the secret knowledge and staged initiation. Its followers descended into dark chambers, often underground, to reenact and contemplate these cosmic truths. There were 7 grades of initiation, from Korax, the Raven, to Pater, the Father, each associated with a planet or a virtue, obedience, courage, preservation, and ultimately divine wisdom. As you rose through the ranks, you came closer to the truth of Mithras, and to your own inner transformation. There were no holy texts, no prophets who wandered the countryside preaching. There was no evangelism, no gospel to spread. The cult of Mithras was quiet. It was selective and esoteric. Its teachings were encoded in rituals, a shared meal of bread and wine, prayers directed towards Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun. Mithras himself was not worshipped as a creator god, but as a mediator, a heroic figure who bridged the human and divine through sacrifice and discipline. His teachings, as far as we can glean them, centered on personal struggle, moral integrity, and cosmic order. He demanded from his followers loyalty, courage, and silence. You did not speak of the rituals to outsiders. You did not betray your brothers in the temple. You earned your place not by faith, but by action. And yet there is no great apocalyptic vision in the religion of Mithras. There is no final battle, no Ragnarok. There is no book of Revelation. Unlike Christianity, it offers no end times narrative, no resurrection of the dead. It is a story of eternal return, from life to death, order to chaos, played out in a cycle of seasons and stars. In this way, Mithras never truly dies, but neither does he save. To understand why this cult thrived in Rome, you have to look beyond the statues and broken altars. You have to see the mindset of the empire that adopted him. Not the marble and grandeur of the Senate, but the grit of the frontier, the weary hands of legionaries, the cold calculations of generals, and the blood-soaked soil of conquest. Rome was a civilization built on order and discipline. While its public religion paid homage to a sprawling pantheon of gods and goddesses, most Romans, especially men of the military class, weren't looking for divine poetry. They wanted purpose and they wanted clarity. They wanted something to reflect the hard truths of the world they ruled. Mithras gave them exactly that. And by the time Mithras arrived in Rome, sometime in the 1st century CE, his image had already changed. He was no longer just the Persian god of light and truth. In Roman hands, he became something sharper, more secret, and more martial. Gone was the solar chariot and the Zoroastrian elegance. In its place, a new mythology. The Tauroctony, the slaying of the cosmic bull. To a Roman soldier on the edge of the empire, standing watch over frozen rivers or hostile hills filled with barbarians, that message wasn't just compelling, it was truth. Followers progressed through 7 sacred ranks. The raven, the bridegroom, the soldier, the lion, Persian, sunrunner, and the father, each with its own symbolism and challenges. Ritual meals were shared in subterranean temples carved into hillsides, or hidden deep beneath city streets. Only men were allowed in, and they spoke very little of what happened inside. These were not gods of the hearth or the harvest. This wasn't a religion of mothers or farmers or the poor. This was a warrior's faith. A mystery religion bound by silence, loyalty, and a shared understanding that virtue meant struggle. And that's why Mithras fit Rome perfectly like a tailored toga. The cult reflected everything the Roman elite believed about the world. That strength forged meaning, that the cosmos was ordered by sacrifice, and that power earned and exercised was the highest Roman ideal. And by the 2nd century CE, his cult had reached the Rhine and the northernmost reaches of Britannia. Mithrae's small, dimly lit temples modeled after the cave of the bull slaying sprouted up in fortresses, under bathhouses, and in the shadow of bustling forums. In places like Vindobona, Londinium, and even the heart of Rome itself, Mithras had found his home. And what made the cult so unusual wasn't just its reach. This was a world crowded with gods, Jupiter, Mars, Venus, Diana. And the Romans, famously pragmatic in matters of belief, they didn't see the problem with this. Roman polytheism wasn't rigid. It was porous, adaptable, and a vast spiritual market where deities could be borrowed, renamed, reinterpreted, and repurposed. Foreign gods weren't threats. They were opportunities. If a new god proved useful, persuasive, or even powerful, he was folded into the pantheon like a new senator sworn into office. Mithras didn't replace Jupiter or Mars. Instead, he sat beside them, offering something the others didn't: intimacy, mystery. A god who didn't ask for festivals or public displays of power and sacrifice. A god whose followers met in secret, sharing oaths and meals, bound by experiences the outside world could only guess at. And to the Roman mind, this dual allegiance wasn't a contradiction. A soldier could sacrifice to Mars before battle, thank Jupiter for a successful campaign, and still descend into the Mithraism to seek personal strength and purification. Religion was layered, practical, and performative. Mithras simply filled a new niche, a spiritual outlet for men hardened by war and bound by loyalty. And the empire, always hungry for cohesion across its sprawling territories, found the cult spread among the legions to be useful. It provided a common language of virtue and discipline across regions as diverse as Dacia, Gaul, and Numidia. Wherever a Roman garrison went, a Mithraeum was never far behind. But Mithras was not the only god whispering from the margins of the empire. While Roman officers were descending into underground caverns to swear loyalty to the unconquered sun, another movement was stirring. Less structured, less military, but no less revolutionary. In dusty Judean towns across trade routes stretching through Syria, Asia Minor, and eventually Rome itself, stories were being told. Stories of a crucified Jewish teacher, of a resurrection, of a kingdom not of this world. It began with fishermen, tent makers, and tax collectors. Ordinary people, no great temples, no state backing, no imperial cult. Just small gatherings in homes, in graveyards, in synagogues that tolerated them, until they didn't. These were the earliest Christians, and though their message could not have been more different than that of Mithra, their strategy, at first, was strikingly similar. Both religious movements grew underground, both avoided the public square, and both offered meaning in a world that often seemed indifferent to suffering. Both created communities bound by ritual and secrecy. But where Mithra promised strength through discipline and cosmic order, Christianity offered something far more dangerous: hope for the downtrodden, dignity for the slave, salvation for the sinner, a total inversion of Roman values. Mithras honored hierarchy, 7 ranks of initiation, from raven to father. He was a god of contracts, loyalty, and earned ascent. But Christianity broke this. Quote, "The last shall be first," Jesus said. There is neither slave nor free. It was this idea to Roman ears, it sounded like madness, or worse, cultural treason. And yet, side by side, the two faiths grew. By the 2nd century CE, there were hundreds of Mithrai across the empire, and perhaps just as many underground Christian gatherings. Roman officials often confused the two. Secret meetings, sacred meals, a mysterious central figure. In the beginning, they all looked the same to the empire. They were fringe, cult, superstition, irrelevant to the empire. But over time, the differences would become impossible to ignore. One god rode across the sky with a dagger, slaying the sacred bull. The other hung from a cross, bleeding for mankind. One demanded strength, the other offered grace. And in that difference between struggle and surrender, sword and sacrifice, the fate of the Western world would be decided. Really, at first glance, these two spiritual behemoths could almost be mirrors of each other. They were both divine sons, both had devout followers, and both were central figures in an underground mystery cult that offered salvation. To the Roman citizen, they honestly probably could not tell the difference between the two, unless they were directly a part of the religions. Mithras, the god of the unconquered sun, was born from a rock, fully grown and in a cave. Jesus, the son of Nazareth, was born into poverty, not from stone, but from a young woman in a backwater town under Roman occupation. His miracles weren't performed with a dagger, but with torch, speech, and prayer. He didn't slay cosmic beasts or bring life to the world. He offered his own body. His followers weren't initiated through ranks, but baptized into spiritual family. His teachings overturned power. Blessed are the meek. Turn the other cheek. Love your enemy as yourself. The rituals differed too. Both cults shared a sacred meal. The cult of Mithra feasted in a ritual banquet that symbolically reenacted the bull slaying. Early Christians broke bread and drank wine in remembrance of a sacrificial death. But the meanings diverged. For Mithras, the meal was about triumph and cosmic power. For Christians, it was about grace, communion, and sacrifice. Although the theology of both religions could not be further apart. Mithras was the mediator between humanity and Sol Invictus, but he never spoke to his followers, never walked among them as a human. There is no gospel of Mithras, no sermons, no parables. He was a symbol, albeit a powerful one, but silent. Jesus, by contrast, for all we know, was a real man. He taught in public. His words were preserved and written down, argued over, translated, and eventually canonized. His followers saw him not just as a divine being, but as the divine word made flesh, the Son of God who suffers, weeps, and forgives, just like us. And in the end, Mithra remained a mystery cult that slowly got swallowed up by the dominance of Christianity. So why exactly did this happen? One of the most defining differences between the two religions, perhaps the most significant, was the matter of inclusion. Mithraism, in its very foundation, was an exclusive faith. It offered no path for women, no invitation to the poor masses, and no role for children or families. Participation in its sacred rites were reserved for initiated men only, most often soldiers, imperial bureaucrats, and select elite civilians. Even among these, entries was not immediate. Candidates had to pass through 7 ranks, each representing a deeper level of cosmic understanding and spiritual power. These were not metaphorical. These were literal stages of initiation, each with its own trials and tribulations, customs and knowledge. It was a religion of steps, secrets, and of solemn inner brotherhood. And in many ways, Mithraism mirrored the Roman army in structure and values. It was discipline, hierarchy, masculinity, and loyalty that were prized above all else. The rites were held in dark, cave-like Mithrae, windowless sanctuaries lit only by oil lamps, built underground or beneath buildings, hidden and evoking the mythic cave in which Mithras slew the cosmic bull. Participation in the rituals were a privilege, not a right. And to be outside that circle, to be a woman, a child, a slave, or just a curious outsider, meant the mysteries would never be for you. Even literacy was no guarantee of access. Mithraism left behind no central scriptures or teachings open to the public. The very exclusion, while alluring to Roman elites who sought private meaning in an impersonal world, also became its greatest weakness. Christianity, by contrast, broke nearly every role of religious elitism in the Roman world. From its earliest days, it cast its net wide. Jesus preached to fishermen, prostitutes, tax collectors, lepers, and Gentiles. He touched the untouchables. He invited women into his inner circle, not as passive figures but as followers, supporters, and witnesses. The Apostle Paul famously wrote to the Galatians that in Christ, quote, "There is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female, for you are all one." This was radical at the time. In an empire built on hierarchy, the Christian message declared that the divine was accessible to all, regardless of status, gender, ethnicity, or wealth. This inclusion wasn't just rooted in theology, it was practical. The early Christian communities met in homes, they shared meals, and took care of the sick and poor. Widows and orphans had places of honor. Slaves sat beside their masters in worship. And when the empire fell into plague, persecution, and poverty, it was often Christians, those strange followers of the crucified man, who tended to the dying and fed the hungry. It's no coincidence that Christianity spread most quickly among the underclasses of the empire. While Mithraism offered meaning in a narrow slice of society, mostly soldiers, Christianity offered transformation to anyone that would listen. It gave hope to the hopeless, dignity to the marginalized, and a place in eternity to those forgotten in life. This universal appeal was more than just a moral stance. It was a survival strategy. A religion that could take root and spread in any household, any city, and any social class. This was poised not just to endure, but to dominate. And in the end, the inclusion of all wasn't just a virtue, it was a revolutionary force. And it helped build a movement that no mystery cult, no matter how ancient or esoteric, could match. The second major divide between these two religions wasn't just who could join, but what was at stake. At the heart of Christianity was a personal promise. No matter who you were, how far you had fallen, or how bleak the world seemed, you could be redeemed. Salvation wasn't reserved for the righteous or the elite. It was for the broken-hearted, the sinner, the forgotten laborer, the grieving widow. The Christian God knew suffering intimately. He had walked the earth in human flesh. He had been humiliated, tortured, and nailed to a Roman cross. He had died, not honorably as a warrior or a ruler, but as a criminal, publicly executed and left to bleed. And then, the most radical claim of all, he rose again. This was not just a new theology, it was an emotional landscape. Mithraism had grandeur, symbolism, cosmic drama, but it did not have a savior who wept like us. It had no moment of doubt, no deity who entered death itself to rescue its people. Mithras was heroic, yes, but distant. He was the bull slayer, the bringer of order and light, but never the one who bore your own suffering. His was a religion of initiations and virtues, of strength forged in darkness. Christianity, by contrast, made the vulnerable divine. And in this world that was as brutal as the Roman Empire, a world where slavery was common practice, death was always near, and justice often belonged to just the powerful, this message landed like lightning. To the poor it said, "You are not forgotten." To the sick it said, "You are seen." To the dying it said, "Death is not the end." Christianity gave people not only a God to worship, but a God who loved them back. This love wasn't abstract. It was embodied in the person of Jesus, in his pain and in his parables and his blood. Everything broken could be made whole, and every grave would one day open again. And Mithra didn't offer this such personal relationship. It was a system of progression, not grace. It was a ladder and not a helping hand. Initiates could climb the 7 ranks, participate in esoteric rites, and perhaps contemplate cosmic truths, but the religion had no central moral story of divine rescue. There was no sin that needed atoning, no cross to kneel before. There was no kingdom promised to the poor. Even Stoicism, another pillar of Roman spiritual life, offered something similar to Mithraism. Dignity through discipline, peace through rational detachment, virtue through endurance. But where Stoicism taught you to endure suffering nobly, Christianity dared to say suffering itself could be redemptive, that it was seen and that it mattered, and that in the divine economy, even sorrow could bloom into joy and happiness. In the end, the deeply personal spiritual offering, one that acknowledged the rawness of human life and promising something beyond its suffering, made Christianity magnetic. It was more than a philosophy or a cult. It was a revolution of the heart and mind. And for millions of Romans, that was more powerful than a mystery rite or a philosophical code could ever be. And finally, the third pillar of Christianity's endurance was its structure. While it began as a grassroots movement among fishermen, tax collectors, and preachers, Christianity quickly evolved into something far more organized. The letters of Paul were instrumental in this transformation, providing not just theology but logistical blueprints. Paul planted churches across the Roman world, staying in contact through messengers and emphasized unity, hierarchy, and discipline. By the 2nd century, a network of bishops began to emerge, each presiding over the diocese much like a Roman provincial governor. The church mirrored in a lot of ways the very empire it was growing within, methodical, bureaucratic, and highly centralized. This organizational infrastructure was a quiet revolution. It allowed Christianity to coordinate doctrine across thousands of miles, thousands of people, and to preserve its sacred text, to debate disputes within the religion, and even respond to heresies with official councils. There was a chain of command, an escalating ladder of responsibility, and a growing archive of teachings. Christianity became a spiritual state within a state, outlasting persecutions through its institutional memory. When one leader fell, another rose, already trained and appointed. Mithraism, by contrast, was fragmented by design. It was not a missionary religion. It had no apostles, no evangelist. Each Mithraeum, those dimly lit cave-like sanctuaries carved under Roman cities, functioned autonomously. Priests performed initiations, sacrifices, and symbolic meals. But there was no Pope of Mithras, no network of correspondence. Rituals varied regionally. Knowledge was passed orally and cloaked in secrecy. This lent the cult a certain mystique, but it also made it insanely fragile. The lack of scripture was a critical weakness in this time period. Christianity had the Gospels, the letters of Paul, and eventually the full canon of the New Testament. These were copied, memorized, and circulated to the masses. When Christians were thrown to lions, they often went quoting their scriptures. Mithraic teachings, meanwhile, died with the priest who knew them. No sacred book meant nothing could be taught outside the walls of the sanctuary. No open doctrine meant no legacy once the temples were silent. Then came the great pivot of history. For centuries, Christianity, just like Mithraism, had been a grassroots religion, but it had been an outlaw faith, persecuted sporadically. It had been blamed for plagues, fires, and rebellion. Yet it endured, and then almost overnight it was embraced. In 312 CE, Emperor Constantine, facing a critical battle, claimed to have seen a vision of the cross in the sky in the words, "In hoc signo vinces," "In this sign you will conquer." He painted that cross on the shields of his army, and after his victory, he issued the Edict of Milan, legalizing Christianity. And with that, the winds shifted. The persecuted became patrons. Churches were built. Bishops were elevated. Councils convened to define doctrine and enforce unity. And by the end of the 4th century, under Theodosius I, Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire. Pagan temples were forced to be closed. Sacrifices outlawed. Mystery cults like Mithraism, with their secret rites and military associations, suddenly had no place in this new imperial order. And the cult of Mithra had no defense. No champions in court, no public literature to preserve. There was no infrastructure to pivot to. It was swept aside not by sword or fire, but by silence. One generation of priests died, and with them, centuries of ritual knowledge disappeared. The Mithrae fell into disuse, abandoned, buried, forgotten, until archaeologists dug them up centuries later, still filled with statues of Mithras plunging his dagger into the cosmic bowl. Christianity endured and started to dominate because it was visible, flexible, and unified. It didn't just win the hearts of the people, it won the favor of the Roman state. And when the dust settled, the cult of the bull slayer was gone, but the cross remained. So after Christianity seized the reins of imperial power, the fate of Mithraism was sealed. There was no grand battle or formal decree, but it was a gradual process of erasing a religion. By the early 5th century, Mithraism had all but vanished from the public sphere. There was no violent inquisition against it specifically, but it suffered the same fate as the rest of Rome's pagan religious landscape. A slow suffocation beneath the weight of imperial preference, legal suppression, and cultural abandonment. One of the first blows was symbolic. As Christianity's status solidified, pagan temples were defunded, desecrated, or outright converted into churches. In some cases, statues of Mithras were toppled or repurposed. His tauroctony, the iconic image of Mithras slaying the bull, was buried beneath Christian altars or shattered and left in the rubble of collapsed Mithrae. These underground shrines, once sanctuaries for elite Roman soldiers and bureaucrats, became ghostly relics, forgotten beneath the rising foundations of basilicas. Archaeological evidence shows us that the Mithrae were sealed off and abandoned. In some cases, Christians themselves bricked up the entrances, rendering them inaccessible to the public. Others collapsed with time and disuse, their flickering lamps extinguished and their altars frozen mid-sacrifice. The Roman world moved on, and the memory of Mithras passed not into legend, but into oblivion. Unlike the Greek or Roman pantheons whose myths and names were absorbed into Christian and medieval literature, Mithras faded without an echo, absent from the medieval imagination. Yet, in our modern age, traces linger. In the 19th and 20th centuries, excavations across the former Roman Empire, London, Rome, Ostia, uncovered the ruins of Mithras and the silent statues of the Bull Slayer. These discoveries stirred new fascination. Who was this forgotten god? What was his story? And how could a religion so widespread, so beloved by the most powerful men in Rome, simply vanish? Scholars and historians today can only piece together fragments. Mithraism left no sacred text. There was no Bible, no enduring mythology passed through generations. What we know comes from stone carvings, a few hostile Christian accounts, and the ritual architecture buried underground. It is the archaeology of absence, a religion studied more for what was lost than what remains. And in the end, the cult was a casualty of a changing world. As Rome moved from temples to cathedrals, from legions to bishops, from secrecy to scripture, Mithras had no seat at this new table. He had no gospel, no resurrection story. He had no command to go forth and spread the good news to all the nations. The god of the cave remained in the cave, while above, the cross rose higher with every century. So what do we make of this forgotten god in the shadows? Mithras once stood as a contender, mysterious, masculine, and martial. He held the loyalty of Rome's warriors, the fascination of its thinkers, and the awe of those who descended into the torchlit caves beneath the streets of empire. But in the end, he couldn't survive the light. The very secrecy that made him sacred also made him fragile. When Rome turned its gaze towards the god of resurrection, community, and written word, Mithras, the Bull Slayer, became a ghost. This wasn't just a story about ancient religion, it's a mirror. A reminder that faiths, no matter how dominant they may seem in their time, are not eternal simply because they exist. They are carried by stories, by structure, by people willing to remember. And when those things falter, gods can vanish. And that begs the question, what about ours? We live in a world shaped in many ways by Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, and a few other dominant spiritual traditions around the world. Their symbols are etched into our cities, their calendars into our years, their morals into our laws. But if Mithras, a god once beloved by the greatest empire the world had seen at that point, could fall into silence, what makes us so sure that our gods and our scriptures and our sacred narratives will endure the test of time? History suggests something uncomfortable. They might not. New prophets will come. New stories will be told. New holy men, some charismatic, will rise with messages that reflect the changing needs of their age. It has happened before, and it will happen again. And perhaps just as likely, some old gods, long thought dead, will claw their way back into the spotlight. Mithras might be silent today, but if tomorrow he is rediscovered, reborn through the lens of a new modern movement looking for order, discipline, and brotherhood, he could make a comeback. We tend to think of religion as an immovable object, but it is one of the most adaptive forces in human history. It changes clothes, it learns new languages, it sheds rituals and gains new ones. It reflects the fears, hopes, and questions of its time. And so the great religions of our day are not guaranteed the eternal life that they preach. They must keep earning their place, not just through tradition, but through relevance, through meaning, and through the ability to answer the perennial questions. Why are we here? What happens when we die? And how should we live this life? So maybe the deeper questions of Mithras isn't just about Rome, or the secrecy, or the triumph of Christianity. Maybe it's about memory, about how fragile belief really is, and how even the most sacred things can vanish unless we keep telling the stories. Because someday, maybe 2,000 or 3,000 years from now, a young archaeologist may brush dust from a cross, or a crescent, or a lotus, and ask, who did they worship? And why did it end? And that's the power and the danger of forgetting. Thanks for listening to Talks History with Donnie Dodson. If you found this episode thought-provoking, make sure to subscribe. And if you found this episode thought-provoking, make sure to subscribe and share it with someone who's just as fascinated with the past as you are. And if you want to explore more of my work, including my historical recipes, video essays, and documented recipes and if you want to explore a bit more of my work, including my historical recipes and video essays, visit eatshistory.com and all of my socials that go by the same name. Until next time, Donnie Dotson.